like to welcome you to this session on Adaptation in Action, a business case for a resilient future at the 20th Global Sustainability Summit. As climate risks intensify, proactive adaptation is essential to safeguard communities and economies. This session will explore the business case for resilience, cross-sector collaboration, stakeholder roles, and strategic advantages of climate adaptation. Let's dive into how adaptation isn't just a necessity, it's an opportunity. To lead and commence the session, we warmly invite the moderator, Mr. Shiv Kumar, Group Head, Agri and IT Business, ITC Limited, to the dais. We also request that the panel members, Mr. Aman Hans, Mr. Ankit Todi, Mr. George M. Menezes, and Dr. Upasana Sharma to join the moderator on the dais, please. Thank you.
So very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome all the panelists here. You know, the case for working on climate, whether it is mitigation or adaptation, has been well known, and certainly all of you are converts, and you heard quite a bit of that also since morning. So I'll not set that much preamble into all of that just now, but essentially the session that we are going to spend time on now, we look at two aspects that can help in scaling the adaptation effort so that we build the necessary resilience among businesses, the whole value chains, and the complete ecosystem for that matter. First of that is really about, if anything has to happen at scale and that has to be led by businesses, then there has to be a business case for it. And then how do we make a business case out of adaptation, which is the focus today, and there may be a few comments on mitigation as well. But how do you make a business case so that we are able to really do these efforts on scale so that the necessary resilience is built and communities also get supported at a broader level. And the second aspect is that, again, for doing these things on scale, it is important that we have collaborations across different types of stakeholders so that many things don't get reinvented or many things don't fall between the stools and things actually get to large scale and on a sustained basis. So those are the two aspects that we are going to explore in this session. Across a very diverse set of panelists that we have here, there is a broad spectrum of elements that we are going to cover. And you have pretty much all the details in the program. But let me, without further ado, start with Ankit. And we'll have all the other speakers subsequently going in the first round for a few minutes, talk about how do you make a business case for adaptation efforts in the sectors in which you deal with, is what we will touch upon. And let me start with Ankit.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for having me. In fact, I was just having a very similar conversation earlier in a small group. And let me start by saying that we know climate change is real. It's happening. We are not doing enough to sort of stop it. As a result, we need to focus a lot more on adaptation. India is a highly vulnerable country, especially from a physical risk perspective. And that's the aspect I will deep dive into a little bit more. So two parts to physical risk. One is what are called one-time disaster events. Everyone reads about floods and cloud bursts and other kinds of, let's say, cyclone events, etc. The other part of physical risk is what are not short-term, but long-term, slow, gradual changes. So heat, change in heat that's happening. Average temperatures are rising. Winters no longer exist in many parts of the country. We also have changes in wind patterns in the country. We also have changes in rainfall patterns in the country. We have changes in water availability as a result. So all of these are the other aspects which are slow moving, but much more consequential over a period of time. Now, how does this really affect the core business proposition? So again, taking examples across a wide variety of industries, starting with the NBFC sector. So from a Mahindra context, we have Mahindra Finance, which does lending to rural India. Generally speaking, we did some work to say that roughly the NPAs, non-performing assets in the NBFC sector has gone up by 2.5 times in the last 3 odd years. About 25 to 30% of it can be directly attributed to physical climate risks. So there's a very clear business cost. It's just that the estimation has not been done in great detail yet. These are based on high-level estimations. What can we do about it? One option is that, okay, let's not lend to areas which are risky, but that's not an option because 80% of India is prone to some kind of physical risk. So you really have to focus on, especially for large companies, have to focus a lot more on how do you deal with this, how do you price this, how do you focus on mitigation action or adaptive action for that matter in the ecosystem as a whole. The second example I'll take is from the renewable energy sector. 2 parts, a lot of renewable energy infrastructure in India is being, let's say, developed in Gujarat, in Rajasthan, etc. The Kutch region in particular, it's again prone to a lot of different kinds of physical climate risk. It can have an impact on the national grid electricity availability. The other part is that, especially if we look at windmills, a lot of the windmills that's currently established in the country, about 80% of them are underperforming because of climate change. The windfall patterns in the country are changing. So again, very clear financial impact on that. If I move to a third sector, which is anything to do with physical real estate, it could be the real estate company. You're making buildings, houses, commercial spaces. It could be resorts, sir sitting here. So those kind of assets, again, in the hilly regions, because of landslides, there are issues both to the asset itself, but also accessibility to the asset, to the supply chain disruption, etc. So again, a very clear cost associated with it. The broad idea is that if you start looking deep, and there are some issues which are, let's say, agnostic of sectors. The last one I'll pick is the heat adaptation. Again, across sectors, we can see that there are significant impacts, especially for blue-collar workers due to heat. It could be people who are inside factories or inside closed environments, but in non-air-conditioned environment, or people who are out in the open. Both of them suffer from some heat-related problems, and as a result, there is also a financial implication for the company. The broad point I'm trying to make is that the moment you start looking deeper into this issue, there is a lot of impact that's there. And this cannot be solved through mitigation activities alone. So we cannot say that we'll get to renewable energy, reduce our carbon footprint, and these problems will go away. So we really need to think a lot more about how do you make the business case for investing in adaptation activities. The one learning from a previous session I am also going to share here is that the cost of action is often extremely low compared to the kind of risk that we are dealing with here. So all we need to do is do the right measurement and make the business case for it. Let me pause there.
Yeah, so great. I think at the end of the day, all of these translate into some sort of a cost or a risk, and then how do you really quantify and get on with the decision making is the perspective there. Let me turn to George and look at it from the way he has been seeing. So we heard from Mahindra and their diverse business, and now look at Godrej and hear about the same perspectives on business case for adaptation.
Yeah. So let me begin by saying, we are talking of a business case. To my mind, the cost of inaction far outweighs the investments which we need to put. So it should not be looked at from a ROC perspective. It should be seen from an existential perspective. To my mind, that's the way any climate change impact should be looked at. Whether it is an extreme event or whether it's a chronic event. But if it is eventually going to put your business to risk, that alone is justification enough to work on it. You know, you draw a parallel between the way, when the pandemic hit, the world, it literally brought all of us, the whole world, was absolutely crippled, everyone on their knees. Climate change has the same potential to bring this planet on its knees. And I think this is the realization which has to sink in each one of us. Many times I think when we speak to business people, they think that this is something which needs to be looked into, needs to be, considered, but it is never on the top priority list. I think a time has come when I think we have to, look at it from that perspective. Some of my experiences, because though I'm now an advisor in the area of sustainability to my, colleague divisions, but I was a business practitioner myself, where I have led B2C businesses, B2B businesses, and infrastructure businesses of Godrej. So many of my experiences, which I share, I think they are, at a ground level, we have actually, dealt in that. The starting point, I think, when we start an enterprise, and I'll go back to the very basics. The portfolio of the business itself should take into account the vulnerability of climate which can affect that business, whether it's the markets or whether it's your production setups. I think it has to begin from there. Very rarely do we do that. We set up a factory, and invariably, when we look at the factory, we are looking at, being closer to the market, being closer to a supply chain, and that's what usually drives. Very rarely do we look at the impact of climate change. Now, if you look at India, and I'll tell you because we have factories all around the country, what we have realized that different zones of India come under different climatic vulnerabilities. Like you move to the eastern zone, you have floods. You move to central India or western India, you are talking of drought-prone areas. You move down to Gujarat, we have coastal inundation. Now, when we started our factories also, perhaps we also did not really look at it from that perspective. But now seeing all that is happening, the first thing which we did was, and I think with the help of CII, we have now got into this physical climate risk assessment for all our locations. We begin with 4 of them right now, clearly to identify what kind of risks exist and how do we really work on both the adaptation and the mitigation. The second part, of course, wherever we have establishment, how do you ring fence the hard infrastructure? Things as simple as that. You have a flooding, and just imagine your substation comes under water. Forget the power outage. You are talking of a huge safety risk of electrocution. So making sure that all your critical infrastructure is ring fenced in that manner is an absolute mandate for all our factories. And that's the way we have started looking at it. So ring fencing your infrastructure in terms of criticality, building in redundancies, ensuring that your structures conform to the green building frameworks. Because when you talk of green building, you are talking of so many things, right from the orientation of the building, to the glazing, to the shading, to the ventilation, to the materials use of the building. All these dimensions, when you ensure, so if you are talking of adaptability, it has to begin right from that stage. It's not, being reactive and say, okay, now I'm going to have this climate change event, so what do I do? So this is the way one has to look at it, and making the supply chain a very integral part of it. See, many times when you talk to industry, invariably people proclaim big announcements on what they are doing on scope 1 and scope 2 in their own factories and maybe the power which they source. Very rarely you will find people going deep and talking of scope 3. when 80 to 90% of the carbon footprint of industry is in scope 3, the crux is there. What are we doing for a supply chain to bring them to speed on this dimension? And this is where we are working very closely with all our suppliers. How do you really, and it begins right from the education, awareness which you have to create, imparting the education and hand-holding them to get there actually. So this is the way I think one needs to focus on. I mean, the canvas is very large, but to my mind, I think if we have to work on adaptation, it has to begin right from the basics.
Thanks, Jai. And probably we'll get back and figure out if you have to build redundancy and ring fence, how do you end up quantifying and look at the returns, although you said your one doesn't need to look at ROC, and we'll come back to that. So having word, both the companies, maybe let me check with Upasna, who would see this from the perspective of an academic, many other sectors and many other companies. What's your take on making a business case for all these investments?
Thank you, Mr. Shivakumar. Thank you very much. Being an academician, I would like to begin with, what does adaptation really even mean? Because this is a very contested term, and people understand it variously. So I think understanding the business case for it requires us to understand what is adaptation, and I think it is really responding to climate risk in ways that reduces climate risk. And the interesting thing is, what is being labeled as adaptation today actually has 3 dimensions to it. So one, anything that is being labeled as adaptation, whether it's micro-irrigation, whether it's regenerative agriculture, whether it's different kinds of practices, drought-tolerant seed varieties, or climate-proofing infrastructure. The first dimension obviously is that it should reduce climate risk, because that is why it's adaptation. The second dimension is that very often you will see some sustainability benefits of that action as well. So that is sustainability in an ecological sense, maybe in social and financial senses as well. And the third is a development benefit to it. So I think having a sustainability benefit, reducing of climate risk, and a development benefit certainly makes a business case for it. Let me just elaborate a little bit on how. It is well known. I'm just trying to put those incessant points in terms of putting it across, trying to put it across succinctly. The first one is, you are trying to protect your own assets, the businesses, because there is a serious risk, and there are multiple examples of that. Just now George mentioned that their organization is getting climate vulnerability assessments done to protect their assets. Ambuja Cement has done that for all its coastal infrastructure and so on. And they're then taking strategies, okay, how are we going to climate proof it? So first is an obvious sense, you want to protect your own self. The second is that you want to actually protect your value chain, business supply chain as well. And there are multiple examples of that also. There is ITC's Climate Smart Villages. ITC has been in the agribusiness for a long time, and over a period of time, they have done a lot of stuff on climate proofing their supply chain, their value chain. Without your supply chain being climate proofed, it's going to seriously affect your business. And the third is actually generating new businesses. Because of the adaptation is going to provide a lot of opportunities for new businesses, and I think that is a really serious business case for investing in adaptation, because, there's an example, multiple examples again, Mahindra, EPC, they've made a business out of providing water solutions for different kinds of terrains and geographies, and how do you build the climate risk component into it is a natural case to be considered. So there are multiple ways in which, and of course now there is a talk of RBI actually asking the banks to take climate risk assessment. I don't know how formalized that is yet, but there's definitely been talk around it, formalizing climate risk assessment for lending. So there is a whole range of things that are happening in the country, and there is a strong business case for that. I'll stop here and wait for my turn to talk about other things.
Yeah.
But thank you so much.
So good for bringing in the perspective of opportunities in the context of managing risks, and we'll kind of explore on that lens as well in a little bit of time. But I think cutting across, we said, yeah, in business it said, you can only manage what you can measure. I think every one of these elements of whether it is a risk or cost or existential crisis or opportunities, all of these need some sort of a measurement in order for us to pursue with respect to the next step on investment and management. And Aman is someone who has worked on measurement and tools, and now with Niti Aayog trying to build on it and spread the word. Let's hear from Aman on different tools that are being used around the world and what is it that one can do in the context of what we just heard as adaptation business case.
Yeah. Thank you very much, sir. Thank you, CII, for calling me. Just to give you a background, I'm currently a resident fellow with Niti Aayog. And prior to this, I was working with Goldman Sachs in US in asset management, where I would say the way climate physical risk is now being handled is much more advanced. And rightfully said by sir, that it is now being quantified, because for a private sector, for money to flow, at the end of the day, everything boils down to NPV. Now the problem I see, and also just to add a caveat, all these are my own comments, because I obviously sit here on behalf of Niti Aayog. So these views are my personal. I always start with that. So for a private sector and for the money to actually flow into any sort of an investment and accrue a benefit, everything boils down to NPV. Now, till date, in transition, so there are two types of climate risk. One is a transition risk, which is predominantly carbon abatement, and one is the climate physical risk, which we are talking about today. So in the transition risk, the business case has been very clear. If you install a renewable project, there are cash flows on account of selling the electricity, and you can compute the NPV. While on the adaptation front, there are no cash flows per se, but there is a different perspective. There is a different lens to look at if you want to compute the NPV for adaptation. That is, instead of revenue, it can be cost saving. What is the cost saving that accrues to an individual, to an institution, to a business on account of investing into adaptation? Now that cost saving can be on account of acute risk, as Ankit was earlier pointing out, which are predominantly disasters, or something which is becoming more prominent. When I say prominent, it's the intensity and the frequency is increasing of the chronic risk, heat waves, flooding, soil degradation, which is impacting. Now, how do we quantify this risk? How do we quantify the cost saving? How do we quantify the delta benefit that will incur to the business by investing into adaptation or the resilience? As Mr. George also used the word, once you ring fence the business, what is the benefit that accrues to the firm, to the individual? For that today, what is lacking in India is the composite and integrated tool. A lot of work is already happening. I came back to India and I met the current CEO and the program director at NITI, and I requested them that this is the work which needs to be done. Everything which is happening out here is in silos, I would say. Different think tanks, different non-government organizations are working on climate adaptation. Everything starts right from the data collection to preparing the report. Now, everybody has a different methodology of collecting the data. The sources are different, so there's no coherence. What is required today? A standardized tool which collates all the data. Where does this data come from? Spatial data. Our ISRO, NRSC has it. It's there in Hyderabad. I personally went and met the DG out there. I was like, everything is there. All they need is, they need a framework of how this data can be put to use by the public and the institutions. IMD has all the data, Ministry of Earth Sciences. MOEF has all this data. NIDM, National Institute of Disaster Management, has the data. We just need to collate all the data together in what we call as a data infrastructure, digital public infrastructure, something that was created for Aadhaar in India. You know, data at such a large scale put to use, and then you create these dashboards for which is nothing but machine learning. In the morning, I remember Mr. Puri also mentioning that CII has already started with this work, and I saw the report. So the information about how these tools should be created is already there. Now the action needs to happen. Niti Aayog, I would say, in the last 8 months almost, I've been with Niti. The work has started at the ground level. Now we are reaching out to the industry because it is felt by the management at Niti that this is a tool which is can be self-viable. It can be viable on its own. The government doesn't need to really, and I completely concur with them. And we have been requesting the industry to come forth and support on this project of Niti Aayog. Apart from this, I strongly feel, and something which I've been working on, is for anything to have a business case, apart from actual computation, there has to be a carrot and stick. There have to be punitive measures. There have to be a reward for the industry. Currently, all the regulators in India, be it SEBI, BRSR framework under ESG, you just have to do compliance for physical risk. There's no computation for it. There's no reflection of the same in the stock prices. RBI, compliance, no impact on the provisioning of loans, no impact on cost of interest rate being lended to a company which is more risky compared to a company which is less risky. No impact. IRDAI, no product on, the products are existing only for acute risk, nothing for chronic risk, which is there in the global market. We don't have climate-related insurances in India. So these are the things that make the whole business case around adaptation from finance and policy perspective. Last, before I conclude, I think one set of stakeholders which are really sitting behind and which can play a very prominent role in making a business case for adaptation are lawyers. Why I say that? I'm surprised. Supreme Court is out with a judgment where all the adverse impact on an individual, safeguarding an individual from the adverse impact of climate change is now a fundamental right in India. Now, PILs should be filed by lawyers. This is what is happening across Europe and US. Look at the climate litigation in the last 2 years, the way they have taken off. Nothing is happening in India. Even the top law firms don't have a climate legal department. PIL should be filed. As Ankit was pointing out, the blue-collared workers, who will support them? The government will only come forth if the case is there. First, the judiciary should come forth, I feel. For that to start, the lawyers should take a lead. PIL should be filed, not just in blue-collared workers, across, for farmers, everybody. It's a fundamental right. So everybody has to waken up, and a lot of things have to be done to put this narrative, the theory of climate adaptation into action. Thank you.
Thanks, Aman. Let me turn to George on point about measurement. I was briefly asking you to think through and building on what just Aman also mentioned. You talked about building redundancy as a method of ring-fencing vulnerable assets. Now, in a situation like that, and if you are to take use of tools that one can build on how to measure, so how do you really factor a number when you're building redundancy?
You know, I think Aman also alluded to that. See, today when you are talking of business case and financials for adaptation, and I began by saying that the cost of inaction should be a part of that business case. And I'll just give an example here to drive home the point. You know, some of you who have gone to Netherlands would know that they take great pride as a country in what the engineers have done in terms of ring fencing the whole country. Have you ever heard of an adaptation measure for an entire country? The dunes and the dikes and all those dams which they have created to prevent the country from the inundation which can happen from the sea. Because if that happens, I mean, the whole country goes down. That itself becomes the business case to do it. The cost of not doing that would have been an existential crisis for Netherlands. So to my mind, I think when we look at adaptation measures, we must factor in the cost of inaction and then put the business case. I mean, it clear cut then goes through. That's many times we always tend to look at it from a payback calculation. So that perspective has to change. So when we actually put pen to paper and look at the numbers, I think we look at it from this aspect. See, for example, for many of us supply chain partners actually, this becomes very critical actually. If a territory is impacted by a climate change event and the whole supply chain gets disrupted and supplies stop, plant stops, factory stops, I mean the cost is colossal. And that's the way we have to look at it. Now, when we have embarked on this physical climate risk assessment, of course there are very standard frameworks available which help you identify the risk associated with the hazard and then put a number to it and do all those calculations. To my mind, I think when anyone who embarks on this journey, I mean, the efforts have to, loop in all the stakeholders. And there are many actually, and I think some of the speakers touched upon it. Community becomes a very important stakeholder to this whole process actually. Engagement with the community and making them a part of it. And for that, transparency has to be there from the organization in terms of if an event happens, how it will impact the local community, how lives and livelihoods can get displaced, what kind of social security we need to create, what kind of upskilling we need to do for them to get them employed. Because you see, these people are the first one who take the impact of that event. And they are also our frontline soldiers, the stewards, who will combat it. So it's very important to include that part of the stakeholder. The second is government actually. I think Aman also alluded to that. Today the government becomes a very important actor in terms of not only the rules and regulations, but also in terms of the databases. IMD issues those agro-meteorological advisories. Now, those are very, very critical actually, especially for people who operate in those areas. So the Ministry of Earth Sciences also provides a lot of data. So, ensuring that you loop in the government, access these databases, do your historical, analysis, use the right forecasting models. And for all this, I think there is enough of, tools and techniques which are available. The only thing is one needs to get started on it. So I think as an organization, I think when we also began, I mean it was new for us also. But slowly as we got into it and we're getting the crux of it, now we are rolling it out across everyone. Yeah.
Thanks, George. Let me take those points on community and government partnership to Ankit and see in the different sectors that you talked about. How do you really make it happen? Collaboration is something which is much spoken, but to actually make it happen, it requires that kind of appreciation and action. What does it take to make the collaborations work?
Absolutely. So I'll take very specific examples. So one of the initiatives we took a few months back, and we are sort of doing it on a recurring basis, is focusing on the NBFC ecosystem. Now, NBFCs are generally the ones closest to the ground. They do small ticket lending, a lot of them in rural India as well. Mahindra Finance also is one of the largest NBFCs in the country in the rural ecosystem. But we realized that this is a topic on which we need to build like collaborative capability building as well as understand what can we do. So we have been doing a series of roundtables, the latest one being very specifically on understanding physical climate risk and impact on portfolio. And we had an exercise where we had RBI give inputs, we had a bunch of other think tanks very deep into the subject share what it means for the sector. We also did a lot of simulations, honestly, based on real examples of how a flooding event leads to impact in NPAs. What kind of measures or metrics can you track? How do you price that loan into it? So most of the entire exercise was about sharing very real actionable ideas, and not just one company. So I had ICICI Bank come and share what they are doing. I had Union Bank. Surprisingly, the PSUs are ahead on this, way ahead on this, I would say, compared to the private sector. So that is one initiative, and we had a lot of learnings from that exercise. Second example I'll take is a very similar exercise that we are trying to do for the tire industry. So we as a consumer buy a lot of tires. One of the sustainability aspects of tires is sourcing, natural rubber sourcing. Again, an area where adaptation has a role to play. So again, we are trying to understand what can be done, what are some metrics to ensure that there's no risk in that part of the value chain. The third example that I'll take is from the agri value chain. Now, agri value chain, also there are two exercises we have done so far. One is in terms of understanding the impact a bit better. So both from a short to medium term perspective as well as long term perspective, how does climate change impact the different conditions for agriculture and what it means for yields, what it means for farmers. So while we may generally think about only rainfall, but there's rainfall, there's temperature, there's soil quality, there's also change in what kind of pests, etc. you'll deal with. So there are some 6-7 factors which will get impacted. And as a result, different crop types in different parts of the country will get impacted very differently. So the idea is then to focus on what kind of mitigative action. So I think ma'am already quoted an example of EPC business, but there's other parts of Mahindra Group where we are trying to promote climate resilient varieties of rice seeds. In the grape value chain, we do some work there. Again, we are trying to create awareness with the farmers. So there's a bunch of different initiatives, but I'll just add with the point that generally speaking, all of this is still very early stages and very anecdotal example. What really needs to be done is at a more systematic level. The two things that I feel most companies in this room and otherwise should do is, one, do you have the right resourcing inside the company which is even focusing on this issue, or is this more a side topic? So I think that's the current challenge, that it's limited to that small sustainability team or 1 or 2 teams which are responsible for doing everything. So unless and until you have more clear ownership within business teams and the right resourcing and capability, not a lot will change very quickly. But we really need to act a lot faster, because the challenge that I see is that the pace in which some of these disruptions will be there in India across all kinds of ecosystem will be significantly higher than what has happened in the last 5 years. The next 5 years are going to be significantly more brutal, honestly.
Thanks, Ankit. So, Upasana, let me turn to you. Both Jaj and Ankit gave interesting anecdotes and actual action that are taking place on partnerships. But interestingly, Ankit closed by saying that in order to do it much more at a systemic level and do it on a larger scale, there is a different level of capability that is really required. So what's your take on that in terms of how do you build that kind of a capability? What actually is required as a capability?
Thank you so much, and actually thanks to both George and Ankit. I think I'm going to build on what you've said, because you both said extremely important points as far as building collaborations and doing collaborative work is concerned, because adaptation, you can't, it just has to be collaborative, you just can't do it alone. And so I think, as both of you have mentioned, there are multiple kinds of stakeholders, and we need to understand what is really required to build that collaborative relationship with each different kind of stakeholder, with the government in a certain way, with the community in another way, and even within your own organization, your employees are your collaborators, because without them you can't bring about this change. And I think what is really needed is understanding how to bring about institutional change. Now, institutions, I mean very broadly over here. Institutions essentially refer, going back again in my teacher mode, that institutions are really rules, norms, that govern human behavior, right? So they could be in form of complex, concrete organizations, or they could be simply rules and norms within the society which govern human behavior. So I think the change really needs to happen at a very institutions level. How do you change institutions of interaction? So right now, we need to learn, businesses and governments both need to learn maybe from the civil society experiences and how they have built up these, for example, self-help groups, Now, this is a particular kind of institution that is able to leverage a lot of community, I would say, willingness and ambition to bring about change. Yeah, and Andhra Pradesh government actually managed to do that. They learned from the other self-help group experiences by Pradhan, by BES, by BEF, by many other, Seva Mandir, Seva itself, and they actually have done it at a statewide scale, having these self-help groups under the mentorship of the government, which is not a joke. So I think and the point you made, Ankit, that in most of these organizations, there is one sustainability cell, or in the state level, there is a climate change cell, which are trying to make these state action plans and so on. It's a great thing that this has begun, but it's a very, very nascent stage, and I think we collectively need to think about how we're going to scale that, because scaling is a very different question. You can do hundreds of pilots, you can do, and those pilots might be very, very successful, but then a lot of adaptation is very local context. So how do you scale an idea which is basically going to work out in a different way in another context, right? So for that, you need to build collaborations, because without the help of the community and the local stakeholders, it's not going to fly. And that learning, of course, we academicians help in a limited way by studying these systems. That how do you learn, what are the basic principles of scaling, or what are the basic principles of collaboration that emerge from studying these systems that have changed, these institutions that have come up. But it's a long road ahead, and I think collaboration from each and every entity would be required. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Upasana. You know, in the Aman, in the context of talking about the various tools and all of that, you briefly mentioned about companies are largely compliance focused, and there is need for policy that can take it beyond. And also we heard all the three examples of the other speakers subsequently explaining quite a bit on beyond compliance what is happening. It's not just compliance, a lot more is happening. But in order to institutionalize some of these collaboration and some of these activities, one needs to elevate, and possibly a policy can play a role there. So do you have, from a policy or regulatory vantage point, any thoughts on what can really help strengthen all of these efforts?
Absolutely, sir. So I'll start with another example of why policy or the government has to play a very pivotal role in adaptation and climate change. Firstly, for any business or an individual, climate change is when you consider individual and a business on a ring-fence standalone level, it's an exogenous variable. What I mean by exogenous, it's, of course, not an endogenous is exogenous, but it's not impacting my business directly. It's something ho raha hai, theek hai, mere haath mein nahi hai. Theek hai? So why should I be caring? I should be more concerned about my operations, my own thing. Now, given it's an exogenous variable and impacts the whole society, it impacts the country, it impacts the civilizations and the world. Now, that's where policy, government, stakeholders, and everybody collectively coming together, and judiciary play a very pivotal role. Now, as you rightly said, sir, what policies can do, according to me, because it's an exogenous variable, the policy, and especially the legislation and the executives, according to me, should be taking a cognizance of the growing materiality of climate physical risk. And how can that happen? Once you have a tool which starts quantifying these numbers and throwing it in the public domain, people are made more aware, different stakeholders are made more aware. And so till date, again, in the policy also, the only thing you hear in the, when let's say an infrastructure project or any policy is being made, they just do an environment impact assessment report, which is nothing but the impact on, the net impact on carbon because of the project. We don't have any study around what is the adaptation required for this project, or what is the climate physical risk projection and how it can be addressed. No study is required in India for real estate, for infrastructure, or anything. And that is the reason today we see our cities being submerged after one single rain, because the geospatial data on the projection of how the precipitation will increase in frequency and intensity in the coming 5 years, 10 years, married with the topographical data of land, how the slopes are, what is the sewage network, was never done. And you have one rain and there is all flooding all around. Same happens with railways, highways, everywhere, because these studies are not given the importance. Again, who will start it? It's the policy centers which have to start, which have to be given clear instructions to the respective line ministry, be it NHAI, railways, agriculture, that everywhere move beyond EIA, a simple vanilla EIA, Environment Impact Assessment Report. You should do physical risk projections on the project, on the investments that you're doing, and what is the level of adaptation that is required. Make a case for it, as I said. Make a NPV case for it. What is the cost saving? What is the expenditure required? Add it to the project cost, bid out the project. That's what is required. It's not happening. Thank you, sir.
So we have a little bit of time for a quick couple of questions before we wrap up. If any one of you have questions, then we can bring them up. So if there are no questions from the floor, let me just take closing comments from each of the panelists and wrap up our discussion. Let me turn to Upasana first on everything that has been discussed. What are you really taking away from this conversation?
I think what George said, that this whole climate change is an existential issue, I think that is beginning to be recognized, even though much more needs to happen. And I think he's totally right. It is an existential issue, not because it's an existential issue, it's important for businesses because they are part of the society and civilization, right? I think one more thing I want to, so a lot has been said about risk assessments that need to be made, how we need to think about our value chains, how to protect our assets, how do we do more integrated, more comprehensive assessments of risk into the future through various kinds of tools and everything. How do you build collaborations? A lot has been said about different things. There is an opportunity case for businesses in actually finding new businesses and for helping communities adapt better and so on. But I think what has not been said and what is the missing piece is the piece on capacity. And I think capacity is a very, very serious issue. Even the point that Aman made, that there is this, Supreme Court ruling that this is a fundamental right to protect yourself from climate change. I think it's basically, awareness is one part of it, it's basically a capacity issue. And I think capacity at various levels, in the businesses, in the policy making arenas, line departments, different kinds of entities, academics itself, where we need to train many young scholars into these emerging issues because people are still actually, this is picking up, but people are still actually, they find it more glamorous to do IT, machine learning, this, that, but the real problems on the ground, and even in the climate area, they're like very allured by finance. But come on, let's think about how to reduce risk for people out there. So I think capacity is a question that requires serious thinking by scholars like us, but also by everybody. How do you think about building capacities is a question I want to leave people with. It's not an easy answer.
Thank you. George?
Yeah. So just one point, I think, any disaster when it strikes, the most vulnerable community is the one who takes the impact. And for us, for corporate India, I think the way to look at it is, amongst us, the most vulnerable are our small suppliers. And there is a bounden duty for, all of us to handle them, guide them, and be with them in this journey. I think, so this is a very important part, which I think, and all of us have a responsibility. The second point which I want to make is, we spoke a lot about, ring fencing and investment in hard infrastructure. But there is one more aspect which we should not forget. There are natural ecosystems also which need nurturing, and we also need to invest time and resources in doing that. Classic examples, of course, are the mangroves. I mean, we are fortunate to be having one of the largest private track of mangroves. Sundarbans is another classic example. So I think that is also something which we should not lose sight of, because the potential there is immense. Yeah.
Thanks, George. Aman, for your takeaways.
I completely resonate with Ms. Upasana on the capacity across stakeholders, be it in the government, be it in the private sector, be it in the financial markets and regulators. Everybody needs to understand adaptation and climate physical risk. How do we quantify it? It is real. And a country like ours, it's more vulnerable to it. Like global north compared to global north, global south is more vulnerable to climate physical risk. It's real. Again, it's my take. A country like ours, where everything at the policy level, even at the private sector, the budgeting is done in a pecking order, that this is because everything is constrained with a limited budget. Instead of just talking, climate change is not just about carbon abatement. Investing into adaptation, as per the World Bank report, has a multiplier effect of 1:4. We have to be cognizant of it. That is immediate. That is something you're safeguarding your economy, safeguarding your people, safeguarding your businesses, real assets immediately. Carbon abatement is long-term. You're doing it for promotion of trade, business, long-term things. There can be a better planning at the carbon abatement level. When you're throwing the electricity, renewable electricity at the grid level, my proposal within the government was, why don't we sign virtual power supply agreements with businesses directly? Why do we have to give this clean power, which is subsidized by the government, to farmers? There's no business promotion, because as Sir was talking about scope 1, scope 2 emissions. So these days, businesses have to go clean. So there can be a virtual power supply agreements. Again, as I said, a lot of narrative has been done on carbon abatement, renewable carbon abatement, transition risk. Now it's a time for climate physical risk, more capacity, more cognizance, and how do we actually implement it with a robust tool at the ground level? This is the question in front of us. Thank you.
Thanks, Suman. Yes, Ankit.
I'll just add that, a moral argument that this should be done will only get us so far. We clearly need to establish that there is a financial business case for investing in adaptation that will unlock resources both for capacity building and for doing action. And if you go out and look, there is clearly a business case for it across sectors. It's just about putting in a little bit of effort to measure that and start acting on it. That's what will really make a difference.
Thank you. So we started with making a business case, and we are ending with making a business case, and in the process touched upon different elements, the importance of collaboration, importance of making it inclusive for the most vulnerable, especially when we look at scope 3 upstream and downstream, and that point is well made. And while resource generated, building capacity of all the stakeholders is rather important to really scale and sustain all the efforts that we are doing. And finally, the aspect of acting as trustees as far as environment is concerned, so that we don't exhaust what we are given. And we heard it echoed through the day also in different sessions. So on that note, let me close this session and thank all the panelists and thank all the participants. Thank you very much.
Delegates, with this, we come to an end of this session. We thank the panelists and the moderator for making this an insightful discussion. I kindly request all our speakers to gather for a group photograph, please. May I now request the moderator, Mr. Shivakumar, to present a token of gratitude to all our speakers. I now request Mr. Shikhar Jain, Executive Director, CII-ITC Center of Excellence for Sustainable Development, to present a token of gratitude to our moderator. Thank you all. Requesting all delegates to please stay seated in the hall for our next session, Nature Positive Growth, Embedding Ecology into Corporate Strategy. Parallelly, in Desire Hall, we'll have a session on navigating climate finance in the Global South. For more summit-related information, please scan the QR code on your badges. I also kindly request during breaks to please explore the step wall installation chronicling the 20-year journey of CII-ITC Center of Excellence for Sustainable Development. Thank you.